Today, we've got a bit of an oddball on the stand, this cool GT Timberline. This guy has a couple of quirks that definitely make it stand out. First up, check out this little guy. A pulley right here on the stem to guide the front brake cable. I've never seen this before. And speaking of brakes, take a look at this. The rear brake boss is tucked away down here near the bottom bracket. Definitely a less common spot. Stick around because we're going to dive into getting this unique ride back into tip-top shape. Alright, time to get the back wheel off. And the fun starts with the unique brakes underneath the bike. Because of their position, I can't find a good way to get the straddle cable loose. So, the workaround is to let some air out of the tire. This will give us the clearance we need to maneuver the wheel out of the dropouts without damaging anything. With the tire softened up, let's get these axle nuts loose. And with a little bit of persuasion, there we go, the rear wheel is free. Now, let's move on to the rear derailleur. First things first, we'll cut the shift cable to get that out of the way. As I start to remove the derailleur, I realize I need to remove the chain first. Alright, before we go any further, that chain needs to come off. Time to break out my trusty chain tool. And with a few turns of the tool, we've separated the chain. I like watching it roll out through the rear derailleur. And there it is, free and clear. Now that the chain is out of the way, I can finish removing the rear derailleur. Moving our attention to the crank arms now. First step is to remove these dust caps. This will give us access to the main bolts holding the crank arms in place. Now we can see the 14mm nut. For a quick job, I'm going to use the impact driver to loosen these up. With both nuts removed, it's time to move on to the crank arm puller. This tool makes quick work of removing crank arms from a square taper spindle. First, we'll thread the outer part of the puller onto the crank arm. Then, we'll tighten the inner part of the tool. And that pressure will push the crank arms right off. And just like that, both crank arms are off, one step closer to getting this frame stripped down. Now we're moving on to the heart of the bike, the bottom bracket. We'll start on the non-drive side. First up is the lock ring, which will loosen up, and off it comes. Next is a non-drive side cup. I'm using an adjustable wrench here, and it looks like this one's going to put up a bit of a fight. Okay, taking my time here. There we go. Finally, the cup is free. Now, let's see about getting the spindle out. It seems to be stuck in there pretty good. Not wanting to force it just yet, we'll move our attention to the drive side. For the drive side cup, we'll need to use a 36mm wrench, and it looks like this one might need a little bit of extra encouragement. Enter the hammer of persuasion. Alright, it's starting to budge. However, we've run into a slight snag. These uniquely mounted rear brakes are actually blocking my wrench from fully unscrewing the drive side cup. Looks like we'll need to remove these first. Okay, these U-brake arms come off by removing the bolts that screw into the brake bosses. I'll remove the first arm, followed by the second arm. We're now free and clear, giving us access that we need. Now, back to the stubborn drive side cup. This one's definitely not coming easily. But with a bit of persistence, there it is. The drive side bottom bracket cup is finally out. That wasn't the most straightforward bottom bracket removal, but we got there in the end. Moving right along to the front derailleur. First step, just like the rear, is to snip that derailleur cable to get it out of the way. Now all that's holding the front derailleur in place is a clamp around the seat tube. We'll use an Allen key to loosen the bolt, and with a few turns the clamp is loose and we can slide the front derailleur right off the frame. Now we're tackling the front cantilever brakes. I'll start by unscrewing the first caliper. With the first caliper free, I'm grabbing a zip tie. The little trick here is to use a zip tie to keep the tension spring paired with the correct brake arm. This will save us some headache down the road when it's time to put things back together. Now, let's repeat the exact same process on the other side. And just like that, both front brake calipers and their corresponding springs are removed and kept together, making reassembly much smoother down the road. Now it's time to remove the handlebars and stem. First things first, we'll snip the remaining cables from the shifters and brakes. With the cables out of the way, we can focus on the stem. This top bolt is what is holding the whole assembly tight. Let's get that unscrewed. Now, this stem uses a wedge system down inside the steerer tube, and sometimes they can get a little stuck. Time for our old friend, the hammer of persuasion, to try and knock that wedge loose. Okay, no luck on the first try. Let's loosen this bolt up a little more and give it another try. There we go, that did the trick. The wedge is loose. And now we can carefully lift the handlebars and stem assembly right out of the fork. Now for the final piece of the puzzle, removing the fork from the threaded headset. First, we'll unscrew this top lock nut and clear away these last few cables that remain. Quickly look for any spacers up here. Seems like it's just the race. Let's get started and unscrew the top bearing race. A little tight. Ah, there was a spacer hiding in there after all. Okay, continue to unscrew this race. And there we go. The cage bearings are now visible. Now, carefully lowering the fork, and we can take both the lower and upper set of bearings. And just like that, the frame is officially stripped bare. We've taken this GT Timberline down to its individual components. Now the real work of cleaning and restoring can begin. It's time for the satisfying part, reassembly. And we're starting with the heart of the bike, the bottom bracket. First things first, a good coating of grease on the threads of the bottom bracket shell. This little step will make life so much easier down the road if we ever need to remove these cups. Next up, the cage bearings. We're going to give these a generous helping of grease to ensure smooth operation and longevity. Now, let's get the drive side cup installed first. We'll carefully thread this in, making sure it's nice and snug. With the drive side in, we can slide the bottom bracket spindle through. And finally, we'll install the non-drive side cup, threading it in to secure the spindle. There we go. The bottom bracket is in the frame and ready for the cranks. Now for the crank arms. First, we'll slide the drive side arm onto the bottom bracket spindle. Next, we'll carefully thread on the nut that holds it securely in place. And to get it nice and tight, we're bringing back the impact driver for a quick and secure fastening. Perfect! That drive side crank arm is on. Now, let's repeat the exact same process for the non-drive side. And just like that, both crank arms are back on the bike and securely tightened. The drivetrain is starting to take shape. Now it's time to install the rear derailleur. First things first, a light coating of grease on the threads of the mounting bolt. This will help prevent corrosion and make future removal easier. Now let's attach the derailleur to the derailleur hanger on the frame and tighten it down securely. With the derailleur mounted, I'll give it a quick test. I'll just push on it like this to extend the cage. Looks good, the rear derailleur is in place and moving smoothly. Now we're moving on to the front derailleur. We'll start by sliding the clamp over the C-tube in its approximate position. Now we'll begin tightening the clamp bolt. With it lightly secured, I'll take a quick look at alignment to make sure it's sitting correctly. I'll tighten it up to finish the job. Now let's give it a quick test by manually pushing the derailleur cage through its range of motion. Looks like the initial setup is pretty good. The front derailleur is mounted and has good range of movement. Now it's time to install the new chain. To get the length just right, I'm going to temporarily put the rear wheel back on. We need that cassette in place to ensure accurate sizing. Now let's feed the chain through the rear derailleur and then guide it around the front derailleur. I'll measure the chain by putting it on the smallest cog in the rear and the smallest chain ring up front and stretch it out to the proper length. Now I'll remove any of the extra links we don't need and get ready to connect the chain with a quick link. Alright, the extra links are gone. Let's connect everything up with the quick links. The chain is now fully installed. We're getting closer to a rideable bike. Now we're tackling these interesting under the chainstay rear brakes. Thankfully, my bike stand can rotate, giving us easy access to underneath the bike. Attaching the brake arms themselves is actually quite straightforward. We just need to line them up with the brake bosses and screw in the mounting bolts, making sure they're nice and snug. And just like that, the rear brake arms are securely in place. Let's put that rear wheel back in place now that the rear brakes have been installed. Now we've got the handlebars and stem on the bench. These have seen better days, with a lot of rust showing. To get to the metal and clean it up properly, we'll need to remove everything attached to the bars. First up are the grips. A sharp razor blade makes quick work of getting these old grips off. Next, we'll loosen the bolt holding the brake levers in place and slide them off the handlebars. And finally, we'll remove the shifters from the bars as well. Now it's time for the transformation. We'll use a bit of WD-40 and some sandpaper to gently remove and polish the handlebars. It takes a little elbow grease, but you can already see the difference. Once the rust is gone and the bars are looking much cleaner, we'll reattach them to the stem. And there you have it. The handlebars are back on the stem and looking almost brand new. A little bit of cleaning can go a long way in bringing these vintage parts back to life. Now we're going to install the threaded headset and get the fork back on the frame. First things first, We want everything to run smoothly, so we're applying a nice thick coating of grease to both bearing races. Next, we'll take our cage bearings and pack them with a generous amount of fresh grease. This will ensure smooth rotation and prevent premature wear. Now, we'll carefully place the grease cage bearings into the races. Bottom race first, followed by the top race. Now we can carefully slide the fork up into the head tube. Next, we'll screw on the top bearing race by hand at first, just to get it started straight. Then we'll use a wrench to tighten it down. The key here is to find that sweet spot. Not too tight, which would bind the steering, and not too loose, which would allow play. Alright, that feels good. Now we'll install the spacer, followed by the lock nut. We'll tighten the lock nut down by hand first, and then we'll use our wrench to lock everything down securely in place. There we go, the fork is installed, and the headset is adjusted to allow smooth rotation. Now it's time to reunite the handlebars and the stem with the frame. I've already applied a little bit of grease to the wedge to help prevent it from sticking later. I carefully insert the stem into the steer tube, making sure it's aligned straight. Once it's at the desired height and properly aligned, we tighten down the top bolt to secure the stem to the handlebars. And just like that, the cockpit is back in place. The bike is really starting to look like a complete machine again. Now it's time to get the shifters and brake levers installed. We'll start with the rear shifter. For this build, I'm trying out these very inexpensive friction shifters. Only time will tell if this was the right choice. I'll regret this later. But for now, let's get it mounted. Next up is a front shifter. Same idea here, getting it positioned comfortably and tightened down. And finally, the brake levers. I'm swapping out the old ones for these new ones I had in my parts bin. I think these will not only function better, but look a bit nicer as well. There we go. The shifters and brake levers are now mounted on the handlebars. We're getting closer to being able to take this Timberline for a spin. Now we're going to run the new cable for the rear derailleur. First, we'll feed the bare cable into the friction shifter and get it secured. Next up is the cable housing. I've already cut a new piece to the correct length. Once I've threaded the cable through the housing, I'll seat it on the cable stop and carefully route the cable towards the rear. As we reach the back of the bike, I'll use another section of cable housing, securing it to the frame's cable stop and guiding it towards the rear derailleur. Now it's time to connect the cable to the derailleur itself. We'll thread it through the cable clamp and pull it taut before tightening down the bolt to secure it. With the cable attached, let's give the gears a quick test. The beauty, or perhaps simplicity, of friction shifters is that there is no indexing to worry about. It's all about feel, so we're just going to move the shifter and see if the derailleur responds and moves through the gears. Yep, that's moving through the range. The rear shifting is now functional. Now we're moving on to the rear brake cable. First, we'll attach the new cable to the brake lever. Next, we'll take a piece of cable housing, which I've already cut to the correct length, and thread the cable through it and mount it to the cable stop on the frame. Once we reach the rear brakes, we'll attach the cable, trying to keep it nice and taut so we have good braking power and modulation. Alright, let's test the lever. Looks like the right caliper isn't moving. That usually indicates an issue with the spring tension. Okay, let's make a quick adjustment on the spring tension. Hopefully this will even things out. Let's try the lever again. There we go, both calipers are now moving evenly. That's much better. Now for the real test. Let's spin that rear wheel and see if it stops. Wow, that stopped on a dime. These rear brakes are working better than I initially expected. Always a pleasant surprise. Now it's time to run the cable for the front derailleur. Just like the rear, we'll start by feeding the bare cable into the front shifter and secure it. Next, we'll take a pre-cut length of cable housing and thread the cable through it. We'll then seat it into the cable stop on the frame and route the cable towards the derailleur. Next, we'll thread the cable through the cable clamp on the front derailleur and tighten down the bolt to secure it. Alright, let's test the shifting. It seems a little stiff and is taking more effort than I'd expect to move the front derailleur. It could be these inexpensive friction shifters, or maybe the awkward angle of the bike on the stand. Regardless, it does appear to be shifting through the gears when I move the shifter. Hopefully, things will smooth out a bit once the bike is off the stand. I'll keep an eye on this during the test ride. Now we're moving on to the front brakes. First, I'm applying a light coating of grease to the brake bosses on the forks. This will help prevent any corrosion and ensure smooth movement of the brake arms. Next, we'll install the first brake caliper, lining up the hole with the brake boss and screwing in the mounting bolt until it's nice and snug. Then we'll do the same for the second brake arm, making sure it's positioned correctly opposite the first one. Now let's slide the front wheel into the dropouts and close the quick release lever to secure it. With the wheel in place, I'm going to manually move the brake arms together to check the alignment with the rim. We want them to contact the braking surface evenly. Looks like the alignment is pretty good. Now it's time to install the new brake cable for the front brake. First, we'll thread the cable through the brake lever up on the handlebars. Next, we'll take our pre-cut length of cable housing and slide the cable through it. Now comes the interesting part, routing the cable. We'll feed it through the cable stop on the handlebar stem, and then around that unique little pulley we pointed out at the very beginning of the video. It's certainly an unusual way to guide the brake cable. With the cable routed, we'll now pull the straddle cable nice and tight and attach the main brake cable, aiming for good tension. Alright, let's give the lever a squeeze and see how it feels. Excellent! Both brake arms are moving smoothly and evenly, and the front brake feels nice and responsive. That pulley system seems to be doing its job. Now it's time for the finishing touches on the handlebars. We'll start by getting these new grips installed. A little trick here is to drip some rubbing alcohol onto the handlebars from inside the grips. This acts as a temporary lubricant, making them slide on much easier. There we go, nice and snug. Let's take a look. Feels good and much better than those old worn out grips. And with that, the handlebars are looking and feeling great. I'll tidy up this last cable and we're just about ready for our first test ride. Okay, so after the test ride, it became pretty clear that these inexpensive friction shifters weren't quite up to the task. While simple in theory, in practice they presented a few frustrating issues. When I had the bike in the gear I wanted, any little bump in the road would cause them to slip. Tightening them down enough to prevent slippage made them incredibly difficult to move. And that front shifter, the short lever just didn't provide enough leverage to easily move the derailleur. So, lesson learned. To get this Timberline shifting smoothly and reliably, we're going to swap out those friction shifters for something a bit more refined. In their place, we'll be installing these new 3x6 shifters. The rear shifter is indexed for precise gear changes, while the front shifter remains friction. This upgrade made a world of difference and the bike is a joy to ride now. And that wraps up this restoration. Thanks for watching, and be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more bicycle restoration projects.